I run a web hosting company called Reclaim Hosting that specifies with getting faculty and students to build and manage their own spaces online. Previously, I was the Executive Director of Instructional Teaching and Learning Technologies at University of Mary Washington.
Okay. So, and we also have Brian. Do you want to say a few words also?
Yes, I'd just like to thank the organizers of this event for allowing me to be here today, because I wasn't strictly speaking invited. But I am living proof that if you're willing to pay your own plane fare and accommodations, that yes, you too can be up on this stage.
You also want to say where you work?
Sure.
Or I can say that, huh?
I'm very proud to say I work at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. We have an open learning division that does open and online distance education, and we also have an on-campus operation.
Thank you. So, go ahead.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go first. And I can talk a lot, but I'm going to try not to. I'm going to try and keep this to about 7 minutes, and then Brian and I will have a discussion, and then he'll present, and then we'll open it up. I'm going to start, most of the art in this presentation, and it's not very long, is done by Brian Mathers. I just want to give him a quick shout out. This first piece was designed based on a blog post by Alan Levine. Alan Levine, and Brian jokes that he and I have been playing the hits of bashing the learning management system or the virtual learning environment, pick your poison. And we've been doing that for a long time. I think it's going on 12 years. And we promised ourselves we wouldn't play the hits, but our session was advertised as, ditch the LMS. So here we are, back where we started. But that's fine, because Alan Levine, who's, relatively even-handed about most of this stuff, and he doesn't just, absently dismiss stuff, was talking about working in the LMS recently. And the way he described it was files all the way down. And I think that image captures that beautifully. And he was talking about Blackboard Learn and some work he was doing. So it probably makes sense for those of us who are interested in digital learning environments, which I've spent most of my time over the last 10 to 12 years exploring. When we hear the word from an American organization like EDUCAUSE about next generation digital learning environments, and that's what that acronym stands for, next generation digital learning environments, we might get excited, right? Because this would suggest there's something after the LMS, right? There's life after what we've been trapped in for about 17 years. This was a white paper written in 2014, and I will get the authors, Malcolm Brown, also Joanne Doheny, and Nancy Millisham. And there were 4 basic principles of the next generation digital learning environment, and this may sound familiar to some of you. Interoperability, enterprise level, data collection, and component-based. So I don't know about you, but 3 out of the 4 of those, interoperability, if you've been through the whole LMS wars, that was promised through SCORM, right? Enterprise, when was the LMS not enterprise? And component-based, we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. But I'm more interested than anything in this notion of data collection. And the next generation digital learning environment actually promises a brave new world for teaching and learning. Not only through the new component-based ideas, but the idea that you would have these various services, often run by third party, centralized around this new system, which they could collect your data. And as we heard earlier, both from the PhD students and the earlier group, that this question of data and what it actually reveals about our learning and how valuable it is a question. Now, whether it's questioned in larger ideas of teaching and learning, we could talk about it, and I'll come back to this idea of the adjacent future in a moment. But one of the things about the next generation digital learning environment that I found fascinating is nowhere in this model is there a discussion anything different than what we saw with the learning management system. Meaning, it was the next generation, it was just basically the adjacent future, as Mike Caulfield said in a comment on my post about this very thing. The idea being that when they came at this, and when you think about what the next generation of a digital learning environment is, how does it take into account student data? How does it take into account the place of the student within the learning situation? And this is particularly interesting to me given that we've come, I think the thing that's changed most in the last 12 years of the work I've done is this. The fact that we've all woken up for a bit, whether we're working in Dropbox, Google, Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, that what is happening on a global scale now, and the events in this city I think reflect that, as well as the US, Brexit, you name it, is data is being used in some really powerful and often ways we hadn't predicted when we were talking about the value and the beauty of open. And when you talk to me about a next generation digital learning environment that's premised around data collection, and nowhere in that model is the idea of how students manage and control their data, I have a serious question about this next generation system. One of the things that came out at the same time of the next generation digital learning environment, leaving aside LTIs, leaving aside integration, leaving aside the XAPI, leaving aside all that's promised, this simple question about data collection and what that means in this day and age should probably be one of, if not the biggest question facing the future of higher ed. What are we doing with this data? Who controls it? And how do we manage it? So alongside this EDUCAUSE white paper was another white paper produced here in Europe, in Finland, and it's called My Data. And this model is interesting because this model comes at the whole idea of an environment for digital resources, as they say here, a human-centered Nordic model for data management and processing. So the idea here, and it's an interesting one, is it's kind of like a Bill of Rights for data protection. The idea of Google wants to use your data? Well, did they ask you? And if they did, and you agreed, do you get a piece of anything they make? Right? So what would it mean for you to give these corporations who are collecting your data the right to share and to sell that data? It's a huge question that nowhere, at least in the US, is being asked at all. Right? This is all just given over. And so for me, one of the main questions that this leads to, and one of the main environments when we're talking about this idea of the next generation digital learning environment, is what if we took the model that we've traditionally employed, the idea of the course as the model and the university as the center of IT, and we placed the student at the center of it, using technologies like the API. The idea that when a student created a space, wherever it was, they had a series, a control panel, if you will, of their data that they allowed the university to use. And they allowed them to use it for X amount of time. So rather than you going to the doctor, for example, and saying, I want to have my x-rays, and they're like, well, maybe we'll email them to you, maybe you can get them. What if it was the opposite? The doctor, you always get your data, and you decide when the doctor can access it and for how long. What if our management systems around learning were built around the individual, not around the course or the institution? And this notion of the personal API, the personal application programming interface that gives students and faculty and staff control over their data changes, I think, radically our discussion around any of this. Now, where do I come into the picture? Well, one of the things we have been kind of exploring at the University of Mary Washington, and now I left, as Laya suggested, the University of Mary Washington, and I work with Reclaim Hosting. And one of the things we've done, and this is built on the work we did at Mary Washington, is we enabled basic retrograde web hosting, and it gets to the point of why are we always pushing forward. Sometimes maybe we need to step back, providing faculty and students their own web hosting space integrated into the system. And at certain schools like Brigham Young University, one of the elements here is that every student gets an API. Every student gets a space where they store and manage that data, and potentially, although we're not there yet, that node, that domain, that jimgroom.com or what you have would be the space where you interact and share your data with various people. So the idea of the web space as not only the space where you manage and control your data, but where you reflect and build your idea of who you are as a thinker, reflective, etc. But also as a space to start thinking about why are we defining always our idea of the teaching and learning environments, which we've heard a lot about today, to a specific centralized system, whether it be the LMS, the VLE, or the so-called next generation digital learning environment. So my provocation was about that. If nothing else, why are we actually pushing and promoting, even though there's nothing there yet, and essentially vaporware, this idea of a next generation digital learning environment that doesn't even take into account the centrality of data and student and faculty and staff ownership of that data. And that's my provocation. Thank you. Oh.
Jim Groom, what happened? You know, I think it's been over 10 years since I've been seeing you give presentations, and you know, you used to say, you know, the LMS is an incompetent construct, and now you're up here trashing the NGDLE, the fine folks who are putting together white papers about the next, you know, generation of digital learning environments. You used to say reclaim your domain, now you're saying reclaim your data. You used to say the revolution will be syndicated, now you're saying, you know, publish on your own site, syndicate everywhere. You used to talk about personal learning environments, personal learning networks. Now you're, you know. So we were talking about this with Philippe yesterday.
Yeah.
As we came back from that delicious dinner, that back in 2007, 2008, there was a sense of mission. There was a sense that the wind was beneath our sails, that we thought we were right, we thought we were onto something. But here we are in 2017, pretty much saying the same stuff. And has the world really come along with us? And look at where, you know, things like OpenEd has gone. So, are you a fraud?
Jesus, that's the only thing they guys clap for? Absolutely. I am a fraud. But I'm a consistent fraud. And I'll say that because, you know, I don't think, and I think the point was brought up earlier, that, look, we're racing forward for the next thing. We're calling the next generation digital. We're talking about learning analytics, not really knowing fully what that is. Talking about what's the virtual reality classroom going to look like. I mean, there's that constant push forward. And in fact, the work we've done at Mary Washington and now with Reclaim has been intentionally retrograde. We have intentionally gone back to the very basics of the web and the open web. And we've built the idea of students, faculty, and staff need to start building literacy around the web and what the open web means from the ground up. So in that regard, I don't change my tune. I still believe the fact that what we're doing is probably some of the more important, relevant work when we're talking about literacy, when we're talking about fluency of the digital, when we're talking about interrogating these online spaces. I think this is where these works are happening, right? This is the question we're having around elections. This is the question we're having about whether information is true or not, how we disseminate, whether it's on YouTube. Every issue, every discussion here has been around the web and how the web is changing. It hasn't been about the LMS. It hasn't been about how to log in. It hasn't been about how to download a document. Yet that's where we're pushing students. We're pushing them into a system that's completely irrelevant to what they're doing and how they're learning. And so I do think that higher ed has failed me, and I had to leave it to realize the greatness that is the domain of one's own. Now, whether anyone else realizes how great that is, obviously this is me going over the edge for hyperbolic effect, but I don't think that we've gotten too far away from the web still being, at least at this point in historical time, the center of how we're reimagining how our culture works. And the fact that higher ed has not done more to engage, to promote, to educate around this space is a failing on our part. And if we're going to pretend to push the boundaries, then we better pretend to actually put students and faculty and staff in the place where this stuff matters. And so for me, going back to web hosting, which is 2003, I mean, this is old technology, seems more relevant than any new thing you can put in front of me.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. This morning, we thought the panel before lunch, both of the panels from the students and the first set of presenters was quite excellent. And I thought there was a couple very interesting exchanges about kind of the special challenges of expecting more of our learners to be self-directed learners, that we are taking them out of their comfort zone. Now, obviously, when you expect students before they've even begun their course of study to take out their own domain as their very first step forward, and then to do all their learning in the open, to expose themselves to all sorts of technological complexity and risk, you're pushing them forward. You've worked with a lot of institutions that have managed to do some pretty cool stuff there. Is there anything in common about what institutions have been able to make domain of one's own, or just at least the idea of using technology as a driver to promote self-directed learning happen?
Well, it's funny. Obviously, web hosting has gotten easier to use. One-click installs. It's not that different from your phone in some ways. Install WordPress. Install this open source app. But for us, and I think this is true, and it's interesting, Tony, you said it when we were talking yesterday, when you walk into a system and the first thing you can't do is log in for whatever reason. For whatever difficult reason, we got to reset a password. That point of kind of an obstacle shuts down your relationship to the technology, to the people within it. And for me, the idea is our questions of literacy should start basically. Like, how are we, and this is something I think Reclaim and UMW did very well, is we integrated it with single sign-on systems. We made the idea of accessing your data simple and relatable. But at the same time, right, I wouldn't even start with WordPress in terms of how to be manager or literate on the web. I would start with 1Password. I would start with a password manager. I would start with faculty and students and staff taking an inventory of all the different sites they're a part of online and how they access them and organizing that. And I would actually ask people to be not only self-reflective about their learning, but self-reflective about their online web-based habits, about how they start to manage and build a sense of identity, because all those different logins, all those different relationships are part of your identity to some degree, or at least exhaust of it. And so for me, Tim Owens, who's my partner at Mary Washington and was my colleague at UMW, made the seamless relationship easy. You can install, you can build, you can start fresh. But I think some of the things we don't think about when we're talking about learning design or the web is how do we make it relevant but also simple? Because that's how a lot of these tools that aren't open source, that are collecting our data, have won. And I don't think learning designers and instructional technologists spend enough time thinking about how to make that elegant, how to make that relevant, and how to make it easy. So when you're trying to convince faculty, because I'm with Tony all the way, like when I sit down, it's about what you're trying to do, how does this change the nature of your course, why would you use the web to begin with? But at that point, then I say, well, you got to learn a little PHP first, and let's go and do a refresh on HTML. They're out the door. So I think it's a balance between relevance, but also ease. And I think that's why WordPress right now dominates the open source web with 30% of all websites, right? I mean, it is a simple, accessible tool. And we've been pushing it for a very long time. And I think if you do that track record too, pushing WordPress as an alternative to the LMS has not been a bad thing. Has actually been a good thing for many of our students who go out and actually say, oh, I'm going to use this tool. Or they go out after they do the domain of one's own and they're finding they're installing sites, managing DNS, installing open source applications, building an environment for a workspace or for an organization. That to me is relevant, right? And it's not, I don't think at all, divorced from critical thinking. Okay.
I have one more thing to say to you. We're about halfway through our allotted time, so I think it's time for us to switch, and I'll be standing where you're standing now, and you'll be sitting next to where I'm sitting now. And before we switch places, I just want to say that I've always had the deepest respect for your work, and deep, deep personal love for you. And I just want to thank you for everything you've done for education and indeed for humanity.
Not gonna get beat that.
Oh. Something's happening here.
Is it logged in, the HDMI?
Oh, do I need to? Oh. I just plugged the HDMI in. I thought
Maybe this is important.
That's the switcher.
Right.
You want to do something like
Yeah, I'll use your laptop if I may. Okay. Well, in a way, this is good. I don't have anything prepared now. So now I have no prepared materials. However, can I hit this?
Yeah, exactly.
I just plug in and start managing replay hosting. Is that okay?
Exactly. I knew this would go bad. I just didn't think it would go that bad.
Luckily, I have a block. All right. I'll just, thankfully, it's all online somewhere.
Disco. Downloaded it.
Okay. So, pardon me. All right. Thank you, everyone. So, pardon me for the delay here. So yes, so when Jim kind of left the door open a crack for me to invite myself to today's event, we talked about kind of pairing what we were going to do. And we were even thinking potentially of submitting a joint submission. And when we talked about what we were going to do, we thought, okay, you know, there's these shared interests we've had for many years, and we thought, okay, yeah, this is the kind of stuff we're going to talk about. We laid out some themes. And then Jim wrote his first provocation paper, and it was about the NGDLE, the Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, which is something we'd never talked about together. I had kind of looked at the NGDLE white paper a couple years ago, and I looked at it, and I was like, I don't know. There was talk about interoperability, and they actually were talking about swapping the components of learning management systems together like Lego blocks. And I know there's a few people in this room that went through the learning objects ordeal in the early 2000s, where we were told we would be able to just auto-magically be able to pull learning components together in these adaptive digital wonderlands for our students, just like Lego blocks. And I thought, here it is. This is a document from 2015, a widely cited document. For the last 2 years, if you wanted to talk about where good, serious learning technology was going, you had to cite the NGDLE at some point. You had to take it into account. And every presentation mentions it. And here they are talking about interoperability and Lego blocks. So, I mean, that struck me as very problematic for a few reasons. So the thing is, so Jim publishes this provocation, and then EDUCAUSE puts out a special edition 2 years on the NGDLE. And now there's 8 or 9 articles about the NGDLE that I got to read. And I read them. And what I was just shocked to find out was, first of all, there was no point about us bashing the LMS anymore, because even the avatars of serious tech, the EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative, that's as serious mainstream tech gets, acknowledges the LMS might be fine for administering learning, but not for learning itself, which was, hey, what's with Brian Lamb and Jim Groom? They're always bashing the LMS. They say it's not a good learning environment. What's their problem? Now suddenly they're saying it. We should send them an EduPunk t-shirt. And it was just really, really problematic. And I mean, on some hands, yes, interoperability is not, who's against interoperability? We want our systems to work well together. But again, A, we've been hearing this before. And secondly, the types of stuff when they talk about it, if you read these white papers, they are showing, like they talk about this post-LMS, LMS, where if you don't like how your learning content looks, you swap in WordPress. Don't like how your discussion board works? Swap in Discourse. If you don't like any, you just create these set of components and it'll all just seamlessly pull together. But you know, again, we're 2 years on with this, and you know what? I know the WALK actually has an incredibly good learning technology group that uses the learning technology interoperability specification really well, and does some interesting things. But at an institution like mine, which is a mid-sized institution with a decent-sized IT department, but we're not elite, this stuff is science fiction. It is completely beyond what we can expect to deliver in our own environments. And so I go to sessions and I hear about the NGDLE and I hear about the post-LMS, LMS, and I get this inferiority complex. I'm like, man, we suck. I mean, we just run Moodle, and we run WordPress on the side. We don't really have an integration. I mean, we just hyperlink stuff. But what you started to realize when I was reading these white papers is they can't actually point to any real implementations of these NGDLE implementations 2 years on. And to me, the giveaway phrase, which I was so happy to read in 2000, looking back on the paper, Malcolm Brown says, the NGDLE has no operational reality whatsoever. It possesses a Zen-like emptiness. So I mean, that's serious ed tech in 2017 from the EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative. Zen-like emptiness. I'm going to write up my project plan now. So there's that element there. So I wrote this post, and I got a few other things I'll hopefully get to. This is where I wish I had my computer, because I had some things propped up. But the cool thing about writing things on a blog and posting it is I was actually really nervous when I wrote this, because I was kind of taking shots at the NGDLE. I had visions of all these serious tech mavens kind of coming up, you know, just pointing out, saying, well, the fact that you don't see value in the NGDL, the fact that you can't implement just speaks to your incompetence as an educational technologist. And now there's all these great LTI integrations out there, and you're just not able to deal with it. So thankfully I post this, this post, and the nice thing is things start coming back. So you've been seeing some Brian Mathers images already. So this kind of stuff just happens when you work on the open web. Brian writes this really nice rendering of what the NGDLE is, and it's just begging to be put on conference slides. This one was nice. Building a spaceship? Yeah, you can see the joke. I don't need to read the joke. I thought this one kind of says it all too, you know. Artificial intelligence? Yeah, it's called the open web. I'm going to skip this one because I'm going to get to that point in a little bit. But what was really cool was Amory Scott, who is just one of the, in my view, one of the best thinkers in ed tech, and she's at the University of Edinburgh, and they are one of those hot ed tech units that is definitely right up there in terms of delivering a quality educational technology experience with any institution. She added her own thoughts on it. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but she really makes all these points far more effectively than I can. And you know what she says is stuff like, you know, the more she thinks about it, she's convinced that the NGDLE is the emperor's new clothes again. She also notes that, you know, that we're at a really crazy part of the hype cycle. Another point she made was nobody involved with the specifications and the white papers for the NGDLE were students. There's an absolute absence. There's these architectures being sketched out, and the student voice is not being incorporated. She also points this idea too, that the NGDLE, when they talk about interoperability, they talk about integration. And obviously she says that's a good thing, but she says, how much do we really need integration on the technical level, and how much of it can we do conceptually as teachers? So she makes the point that a well-constructed Wikipedia authoring project working with students is probably as effective a new media project as you can come up with. The students do traditional and new media research techniques, and it results in a public document. But at the same time, she says, you know, what does anything really need to be done to hardwire a Wikipedia article into a LMS beyond a hyperlink. And that's, we don't need a new spec for this. There are really great, authentic online learning environments that result in meaningful public resources, and we can access them for free, and all we need is a hyperlink. So she noted that, the open and web is a thing, and we can work there. This is the part where I thought she really was valuable, because she runs a big ed tech shop. And she made the point, this idea of the post-LMS, where we can just connect all these components into it, the thing she points out is, once you do an integration, you've only started your work. Once you've hooked and done some sort of API type integration, and you're going to provision that to a university, the work begins, because you got to do maintenance. Every one of those pieces that you've stenciled together in your NGDLE, they're changing, they're reworking, and anytime anything changes, that's got to change. So she says, institutions are in the eye of the storm managing this complexity because they carry all the risks around failure. And then she talks about, well, what are some options? What are some different types of approaches? And she mentions, and I think this is really a key point, that almost all the really cool stuff that's being promised by NGDLE is based on the accretion of personal data. They essentially are saying, we're going to gather so much data about so many learners and about you that we're going to be able to deliver personalized learning experiences to you. But that's based on the same logic that Google, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and all these other big data personalization elements are built around. I'm probably going too long, so I'm just going to speed ahead a little bit and talk about, well, what's an alternative to that? So she talks about the idea of pop-up apps. And this is something, thankfully, I spend most of my time managing, although I trash the LMS, I spend most of my time supporting one for my institution. And I run a team, and we build courses using Moodle, and we support Moodle users. And we do our best to do it. And it has its points. But we started to think, well, if we wanted to step people out of the LMS, and we talked about the pains involved with expecting people to be self-directed learners, what are some of the things that get in the way? So if you want people to write on the open web in a publicly shareable format, and that's all you really want to do, but do you necessarily need to have them start by getting a domain, getting their own blog, learning what WordPress is, setting all the configurations, choosing a theme, choosing a header image, and after all that work, starting to write? And what if you really just want to get them starting to write? So Alan Levine was working with us for a few months, and we started to think of this notion of, as you can see, it's an acronym waiting for a definition, but we call it SPLOT. And SPLOT essentially, I think the definition that's closest to what we talk about is the simplest possible learning online tool. And I'm just going to jump ahead and show an example of one that I referenced in my paper. So this is for a course on law. So this is in Canada, we have two crises related to law education. One is that we have a surplus of law graduates, and the other issue is that we actually have a crisis of legal access. So law services are both too expensive for us to get, and law students can't get jobs. That's just by the way things are set up. So this professor actually created an entire course where students directly critique the legal profession and the structure of the legal profession, and they actually give public dialogue with practicing lawyers about it. So this is a great course for a blog. But do we need to have these law students learn the ins and outs of WordPress when what we really just want them to do is share their work in an attractive, accessible way and contact with lawyers? So we essentially created a simple hack for WordPress. This has a very simple code, which is just shared, and please don't anyone screen cap and share it, because I'm actually just showing an actual live blog from a really great professor at my university. As you can see here, we don't take you to the WordPress backend. We create the simplest possible authoring interface. So whatever title you want, as you can see, we default to anonymity. We do not require any student data to complete this assignment. We don't even need their email address. We don't need their name if they don't want to provide it. Then the standard WordPress authoring interface, and you can copy and paste a Word document in there. It'll keep its formatting. And you add your own header images, and that's essentially, these are all optional fields that can be added that are just for information open, and you save the thing. And there's no workshops required, no training required. I never get a support call. So this is to me an example, and this is, by the way, just a WordPress theme. If you're running WordPress, you can install this and do this with your own environments. So that's an example of a kind of a pop-up and assignment. Was there anything else I really wanted to make sure I talked about? I think we're getting near the end of time. I'm all rattled because of this.
I feel pretty good.
I think I'll just do you now. Well, I invite your questions, Jim.
So one of the questions that always dogs me when you're talking about the Splot is it's both something I fully support in terms of simplicity and anonymity, but I wonder, like, by definition, if it's throwaway, where is the longer commitment on TRU or anyone to kind of having students maintain, manage, and curate an ongoing collection of their reflective work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we have our own commitment to preserving the site, certainly as long as I'm at TRU, which probably be at least another few days once this live stream is viewed. We're hosted on a government-approved, privacy law-approved, big data type server environment, virtual media server environment with all the backups. We get routine security audits, things like that. And we definitely will preserve those materials as long as they like. I kind of like, I mean, I remember Darcy Norman, who often would kind of chide us for being a little too hard on the learning management system approach. He would say, well, the value of the LMS is, yeah, of course it'd be better if they were on the open web, but the LMS is the internet on training wheels. And I would maybe argue that maybe we can do something like this as the internet is training wheels, and that maybe this shows, because I don't know about you, if anyone who's blogged here, the intoxication of posting something on a site and then just realizing that people you don't know, even if it's just a handful of people, are reading it, or the first time you get a comment from someone, either someone you don't know, or a comment maybe from someone you do know. I was actually reviewing for this presentation, and I actually saw a blog post by Clint Lalonde, who talked about the thrill of seeing Tony Bates read one of his posts and comment back on it. It was, you know, a mind-blowing experience for him. So maybe once they have experiences like that on a Splot, maybe then they'll say, yeah, I'd like to have one of these for myself.
My follow-up question, and it's kind of a longer end question. You've been through, you referenced it in your talk. I've heard you talk about it eloquently before. The learning object kind of history. And do you find, given what we're talking about today, given the kind of frame you said we've been doing this for a long time, that we're just in a spiral of history around resources and kind of pretending towards opening up education, but kind of following our own advice?
I mean, it took me a while to kind of find my legs, but I have been. I've been disheartened by how much of the discourse now sounds like the discourse that was going around when we entered the field. I don't think we've moved the shift. I mean, when we're in a discussion like this and the kind of stuff that's being talked about is incredibly intoxicating. But in terms of how technology is provisioned, the assumptions that are made, it hasn't really changed at all. And the metaphors are even the same. You know, the fact that we're still thinking of the Lego block as our definition of how we can imagine a more creative and humane, you know, online environment is disheartening to me.
Now, we're so good that we have 5 minutes for open questions. And so we would love and invite any and all questions from the audience, as long as they're not from Tony. Okay.
So, thanks. It was extremely fun and refreshing and clever. But what really frustrates me whenever I hear, you know, kind of two articulate geeks like you speak is...
And I was worried about Tony.
I don't have the first idea how to make people even care about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
how does the sound of wilting flowers? What does that sound like?
no, that was partly the idea of the Splot, but I'll maybe, this was an angle I cut from my talk, but maybe this is something, this is a little like interesting thing. There's a fellow named Mike Caulfield who I think at different times absolutely blows our minds and inspires us, and at other times kind of confuses and vexes us. But one of the things he did is he wrote this really, kind of in the wake of Brexit and the Trump election and the fake news stuff, and started to really think about what media literacy might look like in our contemporary environment and how we just haven't stepped up. So he wrote this online textbook called Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers. Mm-hmm. So he has exercises like this, which I find valuable. So if you're on the internet, and especially if you're on Facebook and you have a right-wing Canadian family, you see things like this in your feed, right? So if you see this, this is a Twitter feed that shows students being forced to pray under Sharia law in some American school. And Mike, so what I like to do when you're saying how do you make people care is I love to put this picture in front of people. And I just say to them, so what do we do about this? Yeah. So I'll ask you, what do we do when we see stuff like this?
And I would just follow up on that too, to say, like, just yesterday or the other day, the Guardian article about the American professor at Parsons who is suing Cambridge Analytica to find out actually how Facebook uses our data to sway something as powerful as a democratic election, and to actually dig in on that. So maybe we don't care, but I have to believe there's a point that all of us will start to care. It's depressing to me, and I think the long game, and Scott Leslie said this well on Twitter after I posted this very article, not this one, but the one I'm talking about today, but how do you get people to care? And I don't know, like, I can't worry about that. Like, if people don't care as Rome burns, it doesn't mean I can stop saying it or pushing on it and suggesting that maybe us having some control of the stuff that's, collapsing our notions of what civility is in culture, maybe we should start to care. So I don't have a clean answer, but I do think that if we can't make a compelling case in higher ed, who's gonna?
But you care, I care. My faculty come to me because they're having a hard time putting their PowerPoint on Moodle.
Yeah. I get that too. So what I try to do though, like, so for example, and thank you by the way for completely stomping all over my well-designed participatory exercise.
Oh, is that really an exercise?
Yes, we're in the middle of one. I'm asking people, what do we do when we see something like this? There's an answer. It's actually a very direct answer.
Just like it.
I'm sorry?
Just like it.
So, something you can do if you get the main image, one of the things that Mike talks about in his book is you can go to a reverse Google search and you can see what's the deal with this image. You don't have to accept what racist anti-Marge in Abbotsford has to say. And when you do a reverse image search, you learn it's actually not Sharia law being imposed. It's a tornado drill. There actually are a set of specific skills we can use to take this stuff on, but we need to engage it. And it can't just be the job of media studies or educational technologists. It needs to cut across every single discipline. And these are, in some ways, very basic skills. So yes, I deal too with a professor that just wants their PowerPoint in Moodle. But what we need to do is we need to communicate to them that just as we're facing, I'm not gonna argue it, it's true, there's a climate change catastrophe we're dealing with. We also have, in our mental environment, an ongoing and worsening catastrophe. And in higher education, we have a mission and a mandate to be stewards of knowledge and to promote critical inquiry. And we got to start doing our damn jobs. So this type of stuff is just a piece of that.
Are you done?
I am now done.